in the Barlovento region of Venezuela. So his interest is not simply in only doing the intellectual and academic work which he's responsible for as a faculty member, but also trying to engage students and get students engaged and involved with what he sees as important diaspora issues. We are happy to have him here because the subject that he's covering is one that has been touched on in the past in some very, very tangential ways. I mean, those of us who have been interested in the anti-apartheid movement were very aware that folks in the South Pacific wanted themselves to be considered as part of the diaspora, the African diaspora, and very, very forthrightly put forth their claims to have been African peoples. We know that politically, or the political identification of people in Australia, in New Zealand, in Vanuatu, has been as black people, and they talk about that in the political sense. So we are very pleased because Professor Swan has translated some of those commentaries, some of the information that's out there that has not been collated or collected well, and put it in a form so that we'll be able to get a better sense of what it is. He already has distinguished himself as a young guy. He just mentioned that he now has been awarded another fellowship, Council of Learned Societies Fellowship, a very prestigious fellowship, and right now he's trying to determine whether he's going to go to Harvard or Smithsonian to get life. But more than anything else, I want him to be able to have a conversation with you all because this community has been very, very kind and helpful to our visiting scholars. So we're going to make sure that we leave time in the after moments of his presentation to give you an opportunity to engage, to share work that you might be doing, and to get a sense of where he's going to go from here. So please help me in welcoming Professor Quito Swan.
My presentation is around Melanesia's way, and as Dr. Jordan mentioned, I definitely want us to have a conversation. This is just a fragment of what's there. And when dealing with new geographies, new spaces, sometimes it's helpful to pause and kind of interrogate what we're looking at. So I'm very open to taking questions from the audience as we proceed. Hopefully what I see on my screen matches the projector. The color is a little slightly different, but I think we can work that out. Communities to the north of Australia, culturally and phenotypically, are more connected to folks in Papua New Guinea, West Papua, than those further south, even those in, let's say, Tasmania. About 4,000 years ago, there was another stream of a culture that's now being called Lapita, which anthropologists have traced this culture through pottery that comes out of southern China, actually Taiwan, but this is before it's Taiwan, although Taiwan has claimed it. It filters through PNG, well, speed back up. That first migration about 50,000 years ago, it might help if I give us a map. They somehow come south. Some go into Australia before the borders there. Actually, some populations actually make a circle back to Madagascar. So Madagascar's language pattern, at least in some communities, are more closer to Australasian language family than Southern Africa. From Papua, Black internationalism in the South Pacific. This presentation is really about how black people in a specific region of the South Pacific, Melanesia, have intentionally tried to identify with people of African descent across the world. I say intentionally because phenotypically, you'll see people who look like other people of African descent. And that's a really important stage in identifying the diaspora. But once the argument is made that these different populations also intentionally sought out other African people, it strengthens the idea of the diaspora being a real phenomenon and not necessarily something that's imagined. Melanesia today refers to approximately 12 million people. across Vanuatu, Fiji, Southern Islands, Papua New Guinea, West Papua, also a country, New Caledonia. But Melanesia itself is a term that Europeans created, so it doesn't really define the diversity of black and brownness that was in the Pacific before Europeans invaded. In other words, Australia, or blacks in Australia, could have been considered Melanesians, but Europeans didn't define them as being so. Europeans also defined what would be Polynesia, i.e. brown, noble savages, Melanesia, dark, unredeemable savages. They placed blacks in Australia at the lowest of that spectrum. People out of Africa reached the South Pacific approximately 50 to 70,000 years ago. They reached Australia before there was water separating this major mass, Papua New Guinea, which is probably the most critical space in understanding the dispersal, this voluntarily dispersal of people of African descent some years ago. But that's a whole other conversation for the anthropologists. Today I'm going to focus more on the 20th century. This photograph is from the late 19th century. It's from someone the Europeans called Cannibal Tom. Now, if you didn't know where this photograph was from, where might you put this person? Jamaica. Or maybe the Caribbean. And this is not atypical. This is just one fragment. Afro pick, this is late 19th century. Late 19th century. So in other words, when we fast forward to our discussion of black power, black people in the South Pacific already had a tradition of afros. And for me that's important because it kind of reflects, it metaphorically reflects how people of African descent identified with black power, but they put that on top of a version of black Pacifica-ness that was already present, so to speak. When blacks in the South Pacific endear themselves towards Rasta, this is not only a quote-unquote copy of blacks in the Caribbean, but it's also drawing on an older cultural practice that some may or may have not forgotten. It's already there. Once again, this is late 1800s. Blacks in the South Pacific have experienced genocide, forms of enslavement, land dispossession, stolen generations, incarceration, environmental racism, the whole 9 yards. This is a relatively popular picture of blacks in Australia in the 19th century. What becomes really critical is the phenomenon of blackbirding in the 19th century. What is blackbirding? It's a system of forced labor where whites in Australia were taking blacks from the outer islands, specifically Vanuatu, and taking them to Australia to work in sugarcane plantations. This is very important because it's connected to the abolition of slavery in the United States. Particularly in Fiji, Southern Confederates moved their cotton expeditions to Fiji and began to take these islanders to these plantations to labor under very similar conditions. And they called it, the general term was blackbirding. They used a ton of devious methods to coerce people on these boats. One of the most popular cases were one notorious blackbirder. He would disguise himself as a missionary. And he would approach communities, and once they got closer, him and his brigade would take out weapons and force folks onto ships. Sometimes it would be, we would just want to go on a cruise. Next thing you know, they'd be taken to Australia. Those descendants formed a separate diaspora known as the South Sea Islanders. This is very important because when black power emerges, part of that is blacks now in Australia, who we see as just Australian. It also encompasses other black populations from the South Pacific. So the term Aborigine, which is an imposed term, doesn't even apply to all the blacks that live in Australia. And black power was one of these mechanisms in which different black populations worked out what it meant to be transnationally black. So terms like blackfellas was used to imply to blacks, whether they were typically from Australia or the outer islands. Black indigenous struggles in the South Pacific forged relationships with liberation movements across the black diaspora. Traditionally, this included engage in negritude, as we'll see, black power, African and Caribbean liberation struggles, African American freedom struggles, black women's movements, and Garveyism, which really begins our conversation. In 1920, the Sydney branch of the UNIA was formed. The Sydney branch members also attended the 1921 UNIA convention in New York. Leader of the UNIA had made some really interesting relationships with boxing legend Jack Johnson, who, if you know, he wins his title bout in Australia, in Sydney. While there, he forms friendships with a group called the Colored People Association. These folks also become Garveyites. And so this is who Jack Johnson is with, this core of quote-unquote Aborigine, also West Indians and African sailors who resisted oppression in the major port cities of Australia. If we look at the Negro world in the 1920s, we often see communication and mention of black struggle in Australia. This is 1921. Australia sends greeting to the Fourth International. This letter is addressed to Amy Jacques Darby, which is important. She is actually one of the main coordinators of this communication with the Australian UNIA. The Negro World also talked about exploitation of black people in Papua New Guinea. And for me, I found this striking because it seems like the diaspora conversations, they tend to intensify and then they sway. We tend to forget the connections we already made. And then we're back to this moment of remembering again. But the connection was made in the 1920s. And earlier than that, as a matter of fact. Fred Maynard formed a group called the Australian Aborigine Progressive Association in 1925 on similar lines with the UNIA. This is a very critical period of indigenous activism, really phenomenal person. So this is not the London of Buckingham Palace. This is the London of Black Power. This is Notting Hill. This is the Black Panther Party. This is Jamaica's Adela Conte Jones, who becomes the leader of the Black Panther Party, served for a demonstration. She's arrested, as are other Panthers, like Olive Morris, and Obi Egbuna, who, out of Nigeria, he actually founds London's Black Panther Party. At one point, at least according to the London Police Department, the Black Panther Party in London had about 1,000 members, and at least half were Nigerian. It's a very interesting image. You can just kind of marinate on that for a minute. Kath Walker is privy to all this activism. And so she writes this report where she says that the young black people in England and America and Africa are joining the revolutionaries. They're forming these cadres, they're having these meetings in the Caribbean, and there's going to be a race war where blacks in the world are going to unite with China and fight against Australia, Europe, and America. And maybe we can stop this, but I think it's inevitable. This is big war coming. The meeting that she referred to was actually the first International Black Power Conference, which takes place in Bermuda in 1969. That conference was called by a Bermudian engineer known as Roosevelt Brown, or also Paulo Kamakafago. Out of this conference, which was supposed to signify the emergence of black power in the Caribbean, two major calls are made. One is for a second Black Power Conference to be held in Barbados in 1970. The second is a call for the Sixth Pan-African Congress, which will be held in Tanzania in 1974. C.L.R. James also made a keynote address. A group in Australia hears Paulo talk about this Black Power Conference in Barbados that was to take place in 1970 through a radio broadcast. And they decided to invite him to Australia. He was already advising a number of Black Power groups in Bermuda, including this group, which my first book is about, the Black. They went further east to the Southern Islands, then they stopped. Then 4,000 years ago, the Lapita, which is really the pottery of the tracing, comes through the south and continues throughout all the other islands. Vanuatu, Fiji, Tonga, New Zealand, Samoa, even further north as Hawaii. That's the second stream. So what Europeans call Polynesia, as opposed to Melanesia, doesn't speak to the diversity and cultural mixing that takes place before Europeans even reach the region, so to speak. So while communities in Australia are called Aborigine by Europeans, that doesn't speak to the diversity that was there before, or even is there now, because so many of these other islands also live in Australia now, but there's still a yearning for what it needs to be from the islands, as opposed to being from the mainland. Even though they recognize the political expedience of being under one banner. But the indigenous person of Australia, yes, they would definitely be considered black. And if you ask Charles Darwin, they were the lowest blacks. They were the most, they're not even human, so to speak. Yes?
Thank you so much. So I was wondering what the role of spirituality is for many of the people you encountered, and during this entire process.
It's phenomenal. It's rich. They speak of traditions like Maui, who's a trickster, who is similar to Anansi or Ilegba, who travels throughout the islands and does all these amazing feats. In Vanuatu they call it custom stories, where there are these stories of these phenomena taking place. Ancestors is a very common idea. In Vanuatu there's a place, they drink a drink called kava, which is this green plant and it's strained, and different islands drink it differently, but it's very sacred. And they have traditions, for example, that say the deities drank kava first. There's another major tradition in Vanuatu. Walter Linney, who was the leader of the Vanuatu party, his father was an Anglican priest. He became a priest, but he always remembered these customs. And so when Vanuatu went independent, they put in the Constitution that indigenous law and world views would be equal to Western systems. The indigenous law had a place in the Constitution, which also correlated to these spiritual traditions. One of his own traditions is that from his island, one of his oldest ancestors, her name was Ninu, she learned the art of weaving from the deity named Tagara. And she taught it to the other women, who taught it to other villages, and they were given land. You all know bungee jumping, yes? Jump, bungee. There's a community of folks in Vanuatu where that really comes from. And there's this legend where a husband had physically abused his wife, and she ran away. He chased her. She climbed a tree, tied her foot to a vine, and jumped off the tree. He jumped off after. So that tradition now, all the males have to go to their rites of passage, which speaks to a lot to the conceptions of womanhood in that space. But that's just the beginning. They have this ancient tradition called sand writing, where they say they learn to write different pictograms from natural phenomena, from animals, from deities. The deities could be volcanoes, they could be rocks. They speak of a volcano used to live here, then it moved that way because it wanted to see the sun rise, it's supposed to see the sunset. It's a rich, it's a sea of these spiritual traditions. It's even tattooing. There are all these really critical spiritual connections across the region. And obviously they're not the same, but they're connected. In Australia, they speak of the dreaming. And the dreaming is this constant state of engagement with natural phenomena. It also explains diasporic migration. But different dreaming stories are owned by different communities. So there's also a way of identifying with a particular ethnic group. But the spiritual connections are really rich and deep in the space, really rich. In other words, colonialism definitely had a major impact on the space, but it didn't erase these, that's connection to other worldviews or early worldviews by any sense. Johnson.
What connections were there between the Panthers and the United Region and back in the States?
That's a great
question, Quito. Can you repeat the question? Can you repeat the question?
Sure. What's the connection between the Panthers and Black Panthers in the United States?
Yes.
In New Zealand, one of the connections was definitely through imagery and through literature. So Black Panther literature is being read consistently. Bobby Seale's works, Aldous Cleaver's works, So Nice, very popular. In New Zealand, a group of Maori activists, well, actually not just Maori, but they were from other islands. They formed a Polynesian Panther Party. Australia's Black Panther Party, they also utilized the 10-point program and applied to the condition. They created police watches, police patrols. The 10-point program by the Black Panther Party, United States.
They adapted, or was it the same?
Pretty much the same. Because land dispossession, stir, police brutality, incarceration. They looked at it and said, "This is we have to change a single mind because it's pertinent." I think that also speaks to the power of Black power, in that the symbolism of it was clear enough that it could be applied. Now, in practice, obviously, they embodied tactics that were fit into their spaces, but in terms of the large ideals, they saw a clear synergy. But there were attempts of Black Panthers to travel to Australia. Angela Davis is probably one of the most popular. But she comes to Australia not really at the height of the Black Panther Party, but her work is being referred to by activists such as Bobby Sykes from Australia very consistently. So the political prisoners, George Jackson, these folks are very visible. So there aren't always these really direct material connections, so to speak, but the ideological connections are really clear. Pretty clear.
Ask a kind of follow-up.
Sure.
You mentioned that they were, so they're getting these books and all this. Where's this coming from? How they get?
A few bookstores.
Okay.
As a matter of fact, the student bookstore at the University of Papua New Guinea was considered a problem because they just had the books. There was a strong Communist Party in Australia, and while Black Australia looked at the party with a lot of suspicion, the party still created spaces for countryman literature and media and newspapers to flourish. Another really popular way was African American GIs who remained in Australia, and they also were these major conduits of literature as well.
Sailors?
Some sailors, some former soldiers who stayed alone, and that's a great question because it's a tradition of that. So in the 1920s, someone who described himself as an exile in Sydney writes to Carl G. Woodson. And he says, I have the African Blood Brotherhood's Crusader, Negro World, I have The Emancipator, which is by W. Domingo. I have the Journal of Negro History. How can I get more of this literature? So those networks of the literature, that's a theme, a running theme that I think maybe goes in different fits and starts, but it's a constant way in which literature is passed along. And there are also folks who travel to the United States as well in other spaces, as poets, playwrights, sometimes activists, also students. We typically took back. So, for example, those in New Caledonia, they typically started in Paris. So, from Fanon to Negritude to that literature, they're going to take their stuff back. And hopefully, it's not confiscated at the airport, which typically happens as well.
Was that houses in Palau, or was that too far?
No, Palau is connected as well. And once again, for me, this is a fragmented discussion. What's coming out of places like Palau and Micronesia and the Marshall Islands, at least at the forefront, is the nuclear testing that's taking place in the region. And we tend to think of, we remember the bombing in 1945 in World War II as the end, but it's the beginning for the Pacific. Micronesia is bombed, hundreds of bombs dropped in Micronesia, hundreds. And activists from this region are very vocal about the health impact, the negative health impact that it has, particularly the creation of what they called jellyfish babies, which were these children that were being born from radioactive regions that were deformed, and the United States has denied this, but this was a common report from many of these spaces. So Palau is definitely a connection, and the nuclear-free conference that takes place in Fiji is activists from all across the region, and also the women's conferences. There's folks from all across these islands. They really interesting were able to, at least in those spaces, work through these divisions that Europeans had created in terms of you're up there and you're Micronesian and you're not us. They were able to work through a lot of that because nuclear testing was impacting all of it, particularly French regions and United States colonized spaces. Yes?
Well, yeah, first of all, thanks for the lecture. I didn't know almost any of this, so this is really interesting. I was just curious if you could ask, or if you could answer, like, what Carlos Moore did. I don't know why he's controversial. Or
maybe Dr. Jordan could.
Maybe this guy can tell.
Okay. And I was also just kind of curious if, with Australia's involvement with Vietnam, if like the Australian like a Black Panther Party also like resisted that, or resisted the draft, or had like any sort of connections with like more like anti-war like in general, or was it were they not drafted at the same level as they were in the United States?
They were, and typically speaking, not only the war against Vietnam, but also anti-apartheid movement. They were very visible in Australia, but blacks in Australia critiqued those spaces and said, if you could denounce Vietnam, you can denounce apartheid in Australia, why can't you support us more, our black movement inside Australia? But it is part of the conversation. To the point that, for example, in Vanuatu, and many of these activists' writings, they talk about, if you don't give us independence, this will be another Vietnam. Or this will be Algeria. You're pushing us to this point. And there were a number of Vietnamese that had been indentured servants or laborers, rather, working in these spaces that were seen as a threat. So during Vietnam, the French actually sent a number of these Vietnamese back. They kicked them out of Vanuatu after a number of these folks had galvanized around Vietnamese issues, and they were guillotined in the 1930s, actually. And so that also created an interesting space because you also saw these connections with other Asian communities as well. Which, once again, for me, this is a fragmented discussion because there's so many other streams and complexities that really need to be explored. One of them, for me, one of the most critical is that the creation of the Atlantic takes place at the same time the Pacific is being created. What I mean by that is not the indigenous communities that were there prior, but our notions of what race is, at least how Europeans developed one notion of race. The Pacific is always part of that conversation. Even when we talk of the Berlin Conference, for example, the Pacific is part of the conversation. For example, Britain is giving Egypt from France because Britain says, okay, France, you can have New Caledonia, or French Polynesia, a part of the same deal. Germany's first colony is East New Guinea. Before Germany, East Africa, New Guinea is first. This space is part of the conversation. We can't speak of the Panama Canal and not talk about the Pacific. What's the point of the canal? This isn't part of our conception, but it should be. So once again, for me, this is an avenue of opening up even broader questions conversations about geopolitics. Indonesia is a part of this conversation as well. Indonesia is a critical colonizer in West Papua, which also then overlaps to a particular Bandung conference. Because at Bandung, as a matter of policy, it was accepted that participants in Bandung would accept Indonesia's rights, quote unquote, to West Papua. But blacks in West Papua resisted that, and they also sought out support from blacks across the world, with really strong statements like, Negroes in West Papua, we need your help. We need help from African brothers and sisters in the 1950s. If you fast forward today, it's not so uncommon to see Facebook posts of West Papuans speaking of violence in their communities. That's a long-standing conversation that we were a part of. We just somehow forgotten.
I'm going to give him some reference on Carlos Moore.
Oh, absolutely.
The reason nobody wants to talk about Carlos Moore, but nobody knows what to say about Carlos Moore. Carlos Moore was an extremely talented individual from Cuba who was a linguist. And he spoke French, Spanish, Portuguese, and he then became involved with Africa and learned many African languages as well. But he was exiled himself from Cuba when he was accused of agitating and talking about Cuba as a racist nation. So if you, he has two very famous books. One is Castro with Blacks in Africa. The other is This Bitch of a Life, which is a biography of Fela. He also was the editor of Présence Africaine, which was one of the most important cultural journals that ever came out of the diaspora. But he also turns up in Angola, working for counter-revolutionaries in Angola who were backed by the US CIA. So that's where you begin seeing people try to figure out really who this guy is. But he continued to denounce Cuba. He claims they put out a hit on him, and he runs around the world. He then contracts cancer, and then goes back to Cuba to get treated because they have the best health care. So it's that's the movie that hasn't been made. You make a movie about this guy, it would be fun.
Yes, sir.
I've rarely been to a lecture where all of the information is entirely new to me. Thank you for that.
Well, thank you.
Dr. Jordan, for bringing you here. Two questions. One is, what is the political and cultural legacy of the movements you've talked about today? Are there connections with the African Union or things in the United States? That's the first question. And the second is, if you were giving advice to someone who is ignorant, as I've just confessed myself to be, about how to get up to speed on this, what would be the books or articles or scholars that I ought to know about?
Thank you, sir.
In addition to yourself.
That's a great question. Neocolonialism produced a regional body called South Pacific Commission that was generally supposed to be much like what the French do in West Africa, a commonwealth of Pacific nations, with France still being central to the way forward after independence. Vanuatu achieved independence in 1980, which gave them the benefit of seeing, at least in that moment, the pitfalls of nationalism that some of the other countries went through. For example, Fiji is a hotbed for political issues because it has a large East Indian population. Similar to what the British did in Guyana or Trinidad, they brought East Indians to Vanuatu, ironically from Gujarat, which is a major area where Afro-Indians actually populate. Vanuatu saw itself as, it's the first country to declare itself as being nuclear free in terms of policy amongst these islands. It saw itself as being the Cuba of the South Pacific. So once independence was taken, they gave only two national awards went to folks who were not from Vanuatu. One was Paulu, other was Fidel Castro. As opposed to just joining the South Pacific Commission, they created a Melanesian spearhead group, which was supposed to be this regional wing of Melanesia so that they could engage the world as one Black Pacific bloc, which includes Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, Fiji, and technically New Caledonia, but they're still a colony of France. So they have they have a status, but they can't vote in this political body. In essence, this group is really the legacy of these movements in an era that's the most critical concern is probably environmental destruction. Climate change is having a big impact on this island, particularly because the sea level is rising. Ironically, Indonesia, because it controls West Papua and has a lot of wealth, a lot of support from the United States, vast mining interests, has been allowed to join the Melanesian spearhead group. So they're seen as a colonizer on one hand, but yet they have this voting status inside this commission that's supposed to be for the folks who are fighting against Indonesia. So the provisional government of West Papua is a part of the commission, but they can't vote. Indonesia can. And it's now very complicated because some of these nationalist leaders, as we've seen in Africa and other spaces, decades after political independence, some things have changed. So in Vanuatu, which is really, and I hope I'm answering the question, it's, as you can see, a number of different islands. And it's very diverse. About 90% of the government's economic resources go to the main island, Port Vila, or really Kifate. And so most of the other islands, they still engage in traditional forms of economics and culture and systems. So I had the blessing, I'm not really sure how this happened, but I ended up at this meeting for a group called the Melanesian Institute. And it was this humongous self-sustaining community in one of these other islands that were, I was going to say toying with the idea. They weren't toying, they were really serious. They were trying to build a paper currency based upon indigenous technology or indigenous currency. What is that in the Vanuatu context? Pig tusks. Pig tusks were seen as something that was very culturally important to society. So I entered this room and there was it was like a reserve bank of pig's tusks, where people were sending these tusks from all around other islands and saying, once we make paper money, based upon what we have, we'll have some sort of economy. The government refuses to accept this because, in essence, they're creating a separate currency that they say most of the islanders use anyway. And there's a ton of young people that are involved in this process. They're also reteaching the islands the ancient sand writing. While Europeans would say you had no writing, they had writing, and they're teaching the youth the spiritual systems. And there's this clash that's about to take place. So for me, that was interesting because it's clearly a youth movement that's trying to return to, not simply return to an earlier way, but use that earlier culture and economics and systems of governance to build a better future. And the whole position was, if we can do this here, this can be a tool for other indigenous peoples across the world. So they very much still see themselves connected. But once again, the most visible expression is environmentalism. While I was in Fiji, there was a group that had canoed from Tonga all the way to Vanuatu. And they were denouncing deep sea mining that's taking place in the region. While I was in Australia, one of the biggest issues affecting black people is deaths while in police custody. And I was there during the Mike Brown incidents. In Australia, it was the G20 summit. These communities were denouncing police brutality and engaging our experiences here. But it's not really reciprocated. And in my opinion, these communities are still trying to make these connections and they're still aware of we're going to these similar experiences, but there is a disconnect that's there, which is problematic. Because I think on both sides of the oceans, there's a lot that can be learned from these varying struggles. In terms of scholars that are working in this region, there aren't many that are really working on the political dynamics and connections. There's one book that came out, it's called The Black Pacific, but it's really about diaspora and activism in New Zealand. It's not really about the wider Pacific, but it's by an author named Robbie Schillingham. There are some interesting dissertations that are coming out on Black Power in Australia. I've written a few articles about Paolo in the region, and I'm working on a book now, which will be titled Melanesian's Way. It's not ready yet for public consumption, as they say, but I'll be willing to share with you what I have. And there are other authors. Usually, most authors describe cultural connections, the music, and some are journalists. But it's really hard there's no real concise work that connects this experience to the larger black world. A great book about Blackburden is Gerald Horne's White Pacific. It's probably the best work on Blackburden. And there's another author named John Maynard, who actually is the grandson of Fred Maynard, who was a UNIA leader, who's written extensively about Garvey in Australia. And I can say his work if you be sure.
What do you think of Joseph Harris's Africanization?
I think Harris was really important. Myself, Dr. Johnson, were students of Harris, and Harris's conception of the global diaspora helped me identify this space. And I think how Harris pioneered the understanding of the African diaspora in the Middle East, this is another element. But what's striking is one of Harris's teachers, Merce Tate, who was the first woman in political science PhD in the country, was a stalwart at Harvard University for quite some time, did some really critical works on black populations in New Guinea, Hawaii as well. So that would be another person. Her work was primarily in the 1970s, but her work has largely been forgotten in the larger body of international relations and black communities in the South Pacific. So Harris is connected to that tradition as well.
Put out the film too.
Leroy?
Black Panther Woman. Black Panther Woman. Which is about Black Power.
And you all showed it here.
Yeah, we showed it. That's what Alex came to. Right. So we have that film. It's a film about the Black Panthers in Australia and the gathering where they come back and reconnect with Panthers from Israel, India, and other places here in Catholic People's House in the U.S. But it includes the video of Walker that you saw on the screen.
And there's a documentary on the Polynesian Panthers as well that came out a couple years ago. Thank you.
I'm a grad student here, and I actually study international solidarity during the 1970s. And I'm curious what kind of international connections beyond Black internationalism these groups in the South Pacific were involved in. I would assume that they were involved in nuclear disarmament and things like that. But was there any connection to, say, the people of South and Central America in the 1970s and 80s, especially maybe indigenous groups that were like the Mapuche? something who were struggling against neocolonialism at the time?
Yes, and actually, this Pacific Women's Conference, once again, this network of black women in the Pacific, they were part of a larger network of women who organized in the 1970s. They traveled to Mexico, they traveled to Australia. But one thing that the resounding response in these spaces were they found themselves consistently reminded, either indirectly or directly, that they were black and brown people. And there was this big disconnect with white women feminists and their political struggles. That seemed to be the resounding issue. So they definitely engaged in feminist movements, but in the Pacific, they seemed to be really clear to speak from positions of being colonized people and how that was really important and how they couldn't have one discussion about the other, because in Australia, at these white women's circles, but the racial elements being denounced. And so their role in the anti-nuclear movement was really critical, because until 1975, the notion was nuclear-free Pacific, but they challenged that and said, no, it should be nuclear-free and independent Pacific, because we're colonized. And for us, the nuclear thing is not just about the environment, it's also about political sovereignty. So they also played really central roles in some of these other movements. The nuclear-free one probably being the most long-standing, and which runs into the 80s.
What role is University of Papua New Guinea today? Would you say they're, well?
That's a good question. It seems like PNG is a really interesting country. A really interesting country. As in other spaces, it seems like the governments are putting resources in other areas. And the money trails is going towards big business. The discussions of culture and history are largely taking a backseat to other questions of labor, other questions of youth development, to the point that even down to the public school system, the narrative of independence is not as widely taught as it should. So the programs that have this memory, and I'm speaking very general, because I don't know to the extent, but just in my brief experience, they're not being supported as much. So it's a challenge to actually move to those spaces. But at the same time, it's really important because there's a lot of, for example, the archives in PNG, there was a fire that took place maybe a year before I got there, and they didn't have the resources to, fix it because they needed the funds for other areas that they felt were more of a concern. So the historian or scholar may be upset, but the reality of it is, what can you really say? So the universities are holding on, but they most definitely do not have the same political bite that they may have had in the 1970s. By any stretch of the imagination. In my opinion.
Okay, so we don't want to use him up. He's got some research to do. Please join me in thanking. And we're going to extract a promise from him now to come back as soon as the next book is finished.
Absolutely.
And we're going to see what else has happened in your travels. I would never have gotten on a yacht to go anywhere. It takes more than 15 minutes to go where it's going. When the day passes, that means that you don't know what's going to happen. So I'll leave that to you. For those who have not picked up a newsletter, please do so. We have some cookies that were donated with that. Please pick up a cookie. And I also want to give you an opportunity to come up and thank Professor Swan in person. Thank you all for coming out tonight.